I never imagined I would be the woman writing a story like this. But here I am, standing in the doorway of what used to be my home, watching my husband collapse on the porch in the pouring rain, begging for forgiveness that would never come. 12 years of marriage ended in a single night. Not with screaming, not with thrown plates, not with the kind of messy drama people expect. It ended with evidence. Cold, undeniable, devastating evidence displayed on a 75-inch television in my own living room. And by the time the night was over, the man I once loved, my husband Michael, had lost everything. His career, his reputation, his freedom, and our marriage. But to understand how everything burned down that night, you have to start with the moment my instincts first began whispering that something was wrong. It was an ordinary Saturday morning in early September. I was in the garage working on my 1970 Dodge Challenger, the one I'd spent the last 3 years restoring piece by piece. The smell of motor oil and WD-40 hung in the air, while an old classic rock station hummed softly from the dusty radio on the shelf. Inside the house, everything looked normal. My husband Michael kept drifting in and out of the garage, bringing fresh coffee in my favorite mug, the one that said, "World's okayest mechanic." He was cheerful that morning, almost too cheerful. "I'm meeting Daniel for lunch at the country club," he told me casually, leaning against the garage doorway. "Then we might check out that new wine bar downtown." Nothing unusual about that. Michael had always been social. He loved dressing well, loved good wine, loved being seen in the right places. I barely looked up from my work. "Sounds fun," I said, tightening the bolt. But then around noon, something changed. Michael walked into the garage again, and this time, I actually stopped working. He was wearing a navy blazer I'd never seen before. His hair was perfectly styled, like he'd just come from a salon. His cologne was different too, stronger, sharper. Not the scent he'd worn for years. He smiled at me, a practiced smile, the kind you don't recognize as fake until much later. "Don't wait up for dinner tonight," he said lightly. "It might be a late one." He kissed my cheek. Quick, polite, almost rehearsed, and then he left. The garage door closed behind him, but his new cologne lingered in the air, mixing strangely with the motor oil. I stood there staring at the empty driveway, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But something deep in my gut, the ancient instinct humans have relied on for thousands of years, was already screaming a warning. Because what I didn't know yet was that my husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was helping another woman steal my entire company and planning to destroy my life in the process. And before it was over, I would destroy his first. Before everything fell apart, my life looked stable, maybe even enviable from the outside. My name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old, and for the past 15 years, I've built a construction management company from the ground up. What started as a small operation managing residential builds had grown into a mid-sized firm handling commercial developments across the state. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work. Concrete dust, project deadlines, subcontractor arguments, financial spreadsheets at midnight. I loved every exhausting piece of it. And for most of those 15 years, Michael Carter had been beside me, or at least I thought he had. We met 12 years ago at a mutual friend's engagement party. I still remember that night vividly. I had shown up straight from a job site wearing jeans, boots, and a jacket that smelled faintly of drywall dust. Everyone else was dressed for cocktails and polite conversation. Michael stood out immediately, tall, well-dressed, confident in the effortless way people from corporate environments tend to be. At the time, he worked as an associate at a prestigious law firm specializing in mergers and acquisitions. When he approached me at the bar, his first words were, "So you're the woman who builds things for a living?" I laughed. "And you're the man who tears companies apart for a living." He grinned. Only professionally. That was Michael. Sharp, charming, smooth in ways I wasn't. Where I was practical and grounded, he was polished and ambitious. Where I preferred quiet nights and greasy engines, he preferred fine wine and networking dinners. But somehow it worked. At least, it did for a long time. We dated for 2 years before getting married. Michael proposed on a weekend trip to Napa Valley, kneeling dramatically in a vineyard with a ring that probably cost more than my first truck. I said yes, without hesitation. Back then, I believed completely in the life we were building. Our marriage settled into a comfortable rhythm. I focused on growing my company while Michael climbed the ladder in his law firm. Eventually, he became a partner, specializing in corporate acquisitions. His world revolved around negotiations, contracts, and high-stakes business deals. Mine revolved around blueprints and job sites. Different worlds, but connected. At least, that's what I thought. Michael often told people how proud he was of me. "She's the real powerhouse in the family," he would say at parties, wrapping an arm around my waist. "I just push papers. Emily builds the future." I used to blush when he said that. Looking back now, I realized something important. Michael always admired my success, but admiration isn't the same thing as respect. Over the years, small warning signs appeared, things I brushed off at the time. Michael had expensive tastes, designer suits, luxury watches, fine restaurants. Meanwhile, I reinvested most of my income back into the business. When we bought our house, I paid for most of it. Not because he couldn't contribute, but because my company had experienced a particularly profitable year. He joked about it often. Marrying a successful woman was the smartest investment I ever made. Everyone would laugh, including me. Now I realize those jokes carried more truth than humor. Still, our marriage felt solid. We hosted dinners, took vacations, celebrated anniversaries. From the outside, we looked like the perfect modern couple. Two successful professionals building a life together. Michael's family adored me. My employees respected him. There was no obvious crack in the foundation until about 3 months before everything collapsed. That was when Michael's behavior began to change. At first, the shifts were subtle. So subtle, I barely noticed them. But eventually, those tiny changes would unravel everything. Because once you start seeing the pattern, you realize the warning signs were there all along. Looking back now, I can see exactly when the shift began. At the time, though, it was just a series of small things, little changes that didn't seem important on their own. But together, they formed a pattern I couldn't ignore. Michael had never been secretive with his phone before. In fact, he used to leave it lying around the house constantly, on the kitchen counter, the coffee table, even forgotten in the garage sometimes. Then suddenly, it was always in his hand, or face down, or tucked into his pocket. If he left the room, the phone went with him, even to the bathroom. At first, I brushed it off. Lawyers often deal with sensitive information, after all. Confidential clients, high-stakes negotiations. It made sense that he might be more careful about privacy. But then his schedule started changing too. Michael had always kept fairly predictable hours. Corporate law was demanding, yes, but he usually left the office around 7 or 8 unless a major deal was happening. Now he was working late almost every night. Emergency meetings, last-minute client dinners, weekend strategy sessions that had apparently appeared out of nowhere. At the same time, he became strangely attentive, almost overly attentive. He brought home flowers more often, complimented me constantly, cooked elaborate dinners on nights when he was actually home. It should have felt romantic. Instead, it felt rehearsed, like someone trying too hard to play the role of a devoted spouse. Then came the first real moment that made my stomach twist. It happened on a Sunday afternoon while I was doing laundry. Michael liked to sleep in on Sundays, so I usually handled household chores early in the morning. The hamper was overflowing from a busy work week, and I was sorting clothes between darks and lights when my hand touched something unfamiliar. I pulled it out slowly. A navy blue silk tie. Not just any tie. This thing looked expensive. Italian designer label, subtle woven pattern, the kind of accessory worn by men who spent more time in boardrooms than on construction sites. And it definitely wasn't mine. I stood there staring at it like it was evidence in a crime scene, which, in hindsight, it kind of was. Michael owned plenty of nice ties, but I knew every one of them. I'd bought half of them myself over the years. This one wasn't part of his collection. For a moment, I considered waking him up immediately, but I didn't. Instead, I folded the tie and slipped it into my pocket. That evening, Michael was lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone, while a football game played quietly on the television. I sat in the armchair across from him, pretending to watch the game. The tie felt heavy in my pocket. Finally, during a commercial break, I pulled it out. "Hey," I said casually, "I found this in the laundry earlier." Michael glanced up. For a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, something flashed across his face. Panic. Or calculation. Then he smiled. "Oh," he said lightly, setting his phone aside. "That must belong to Melissa from the office." Melissa, a junior associate he'd mentioned a few times before. "She asked me to bring it to the firm last week," he continued smoothly. "Her boyfriend forgot it after one of our team dinners. Must have gotten mixed in with my things." His explanation came quickly. Too quickly. Perfectly reasonable. Almost rehearsed. I studied his face carefully. But Michael was a lawyer, and lawyers are very good at controlling their expressions. So I nodded. "Got it," I said. Then I tossed the tie onto the coffee table and went back to pretending to watch the game. Inside, though, something had started turning in my chest. A quiet unease. A feeling that something about that story didn't sit right. And that feeling only got stronger the following weekend. Because that was when I found something in Michael's Lexus that made the situation impossible to ignore. The following weekend, I decided to do something nice for Michael. He had mentioned wanting to take a short road trip to visit his sister in a few weeks, and his Lexus, the one he treated like a museum piece, was overdue for a deep clean. I figured I'd surprise him by detailing it myself. Saturday morning, the sky was gray and cool. I pulled the car into the driveway, grabbed the vacuum, and started working through the interior. Crumbs under the seats, a couple of receipts in the cup holder. Nothing unusual. Until I reached under the passenger seat. My fingers brushed against something soft. I leaned down and pulled it out. A small velvet box. My stomach tightened instantly. There's something about finding a velvet box that makes your pulse spike before you even open it. Maybe it's instinct. Maybe it's the way jewelry boxes carry the promise of something meaningful or something dangerous. I opened it slowly. Inside were a pair of white gold cufflinks. They were beautiful, elegant, clearly expensive, and engraved. The letters S.H. were etched into the metal in delicate script. I stared at them for a long time, my heart beginning to pound harder and harder in my chest. Those initials meant nothing to me. They weren't Michael's. They weren't anyone in our family. And they definitely didn't belong to me. I sat back in the driver's seat, the cufflinks resting in my palm while my mind raced through every person we knew. Friends, coworkers, clients, no match. Finally, I placed the cufflinks back in the velvet box and slid it exactly where I'd found it beneath the seat. Then I waited. That evening, Michael and I went through our usual routine. Dinner, a little television, a glass of wine before bed. He looked relaxed. Happy even. Which made what I was about to ask feel strangely surreal. As we got ready for bed, Michael stood at the bathroom mirror, carefully adjusting the collar of his shirt for the next day. I leaned against the doorway. "I cleaned your car today," I said casually. He glanced at me in the mirror. "Oh yeah?" "Yeah, found something under the passenger seat." I watched him closely. His hands paused for just a second before continuing to straighten his collar. "Oh?" he said. "A velvet box," I continued, "with some cufflinks inside. Looked expensive." Michael turned slowly to face me. For a brief moment, something passed through his eyes. Then it disappeared behind a calm smile. "Oh, those," he said easily. "They belong to Sarah Harrison." The name meant nothing to me. "Who's that?" I asked. "She's one of the senior partners of the firm," he replied smoothly. "We're organizing a charity auction for the Children's Hospital. She donated the cufflinks for the event. I offered to hold on to them until the auction coordinator picks them up." Again. A perfect explanation. Clean, logical, completely reasonable, and delivered without hesitation. I nodded slowly. "Got it." Michael smiled and leaned forward to kiss my forehead. "Thanks for cleaning the car, Em," he said warmly. Then he walked past me and turned off the bedroom light. But long after he fell asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, because something about that explanation didn't feel right. It wasn't just the cufflinks, or the tie, or the late nights. It was the way every answer he gave sounded practiced, like he'd already rehearsed it in his head. And once that thought took hold, I couldn't shake it. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing things I had probably ignored before. Patterns, changes, tiny inconsistencies, each one small on its own. But together, they started forming a picture that terrified me, because slowly, painfully, I began to realize something. My husband wasn't just lying to me. He was hiding something much bigger. And the moment I finally discovered the truth, it would change everything. For the next few days, I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Marriage does strange things to your perception. When you've spent over a decade sharing your life with someone, your routines, your bed, your plans for the future, your mind instinctively protects that stability. You explain things away. You rationalize. You tell yourself you're imagining problems that don't exist. I told myself the same thing. Michael is just busy. You're reading too much into this. But the uneasy feeling in my chest refused to disappear. In fact, it kept growing. Once your mind starts paying attention to details, you notice everything. Michael's phone never left his side anymore, not even for a minute. He used to toss it on the kitchen counter when he got home from work. Now it stayed in his pocket, even when he was walking from the living room to the bathroom. If a message notification appeared, he would glance at it immediately, sometimes with a strange tension in his shoulders, before quickly locking the screen. Then there were the work dinners. They had become almost nightly occurrences. Client meeting, strategy session, networking dinner. The explanations always sounded legitimate, but the timing started to feel off. Some nights he wouldn't come home until after midnight. When he did, he smelled like expensive whiskey and a cologne that definitely wasn't his. Once, while he hung his jacket in the closet, I caught the faint scent of a woman's perfume lingering on the fabric. I told myself it was probably from a crowded restaurant, but my stomach twisted anyway. Then his gym routine changed. For years, Michael had followed the same schedule like clockwork. Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings at 6 a.m., he'd leave quietly while I slept and return just as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. Suddenly, that routine vanished. Some days he went twice. Other days he skipped entirely. One Saturday morning, I suggested we go together. Something we used to do all the time. He laughed it off quickly. "Oh, Em, you'd hate my class. It's mostly just corporate guys complaining about stress and bragging about their bonuses." The response felt dismissive, but more importantly, it was different. Michael had always enjoyed doing things together before. Now, suddenly, everything in his life seemed to happen somewhere else, without me. The more I thought about it, the more those small changes started connecting into a pattern I couldn't ignore anymore. So I did something I hadn't done in years. I asked for help, not from a therapist, not from family, but from 3 people I trusted more than anyone else. That Thursday evening, while Michael was at another client dinner, I invited them over to the garage. First was Derek, my best friend since college. He worked in cybersecurity and had an almost disturbing ability to dig information out of the internet. Then there was Nathan, my neighbor. He had retired early from private investigation work after solving a massive insurance fraud case that made him financially comfortable for life. Finally, Vincent, a former Navy SEAL who now ran a private security consulting firm. 2 years earlier, I had helped him through a brutal divorce and custody battle. He owed me more favors than he liked to admit. The 4 of us sat around my workbench in the garage. The smell of motor oil hung in the air as I laid everything out. The tie, the cufflinks, the sudden changes in Michael's behavior, the constant late nights, and the feeling in my gut that something was deeply wrong. Derek leaned back in his chair, folding his arms thoughtfully. "Listen," he said slowly. "If your instincts are telling you something's off, they usually are." Nathan nodded. "But we need proof," he added calmly. You don't confront someone like Michael without hard evidence. If he's hiding something, we'll find it. Vincent cracked his knuckles, his face unreadable. We do this carefully, he said. No mistakes, no accusations until we know exactly what we're dealing with. I looked at the three men sitting across from me, my friends, my backup. And for the first time since that uneasy feeling began, I didn't feel completely alone. What none of us realized yet, though, was just how deep this situation actually went. Because what we were about to uncover wasn't just an affair. It was something far more dangerous. And by the time we saw the truth, my marriage would already be beyond saving. The next phase started quietly. No confrontation, no accusations, just patience and observation. Derek was the first to act. A few days after our meeting in the garage, he handed me something that looked like an ordinary silver pen. High-end model, he said casually. Writes normally, but it's also a motion-activated camera. I turned it over in my hand, feeling the weight of it. You're serious? Dead serious, Derek replied. 8 hours of recording, crystal clear audio. If Michael's hiding something at work, this will catch it. The next morning, I placed the pen on the kitchen counter with a sticky note. Saw this at the office supply store. Thought you'd like it for signing those important contracts. Love you. Michael picked it up while sipping his coffee. He examined it briefly, smiled at the note, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. No suspicion. No hesitation. Just a quick kiss on my cheek before heading out the door. See you tonight, he said. I watched his car disappear down the street. Then I waited. That evening, Derek came over with his laptop. The camera had automatically synced the footage to a cloud server. We sat at my kitchen table, the glow of the screen illuminating the dark room as the video played. At first, everything looked normal. Michael sat at his desk in his office, typing emails, taking phone calls, reviewing documents. Hours passed like that. Then the office door opened. A woman stepped inside. She was tall, probably in her early 40s, with sharp cheekbones and perfectly styled blonde hair. Her posture radiated confidence, the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively pay attention. Derek leaned closer to the screen. That must be Sarah Harrison, he murmured. The same name Michael had mentioned when explaining the cufflinks. But the moment she walked into the room, everything changed. Michael's entire posture shifted. His shoulders tensed. His hands stopped typing mid-sentence, and he avoided looking directly at her. Sarah closed the door behind her without knocking. Then she walked slowly toward his desk. You understand what happens if this deal falls through, right? She said quietly. Her voice was calm, but there was steel underneath it. Michael swallowed. This isn't just about you and me anymore, she continued. The entire acquisition depends on this. My heart started pounding. Michael leaned back in his chair, lowering his voice. I know, he said, but I need more time. Emily doesn't suspect anything yet. My blood ran cold. He never called me Emily when speaking to others. He always used my full name. Sarah stepped closer, resting one hand on the edge of his desk. Time is something we don't have, she replied. The board meets in 2 weeks. Her fingers tapped slowly against the wood. You need to get those documents from her home office before then. The room went silent. Derek and I stared at the screen. Documents. From my home office. My mind raced. The only documents in my home office were related to my company's upcoming acquisition deal, a negotiation that had taken months to finalize. Sensitive financial projections, internal strategy plans, information that could destroy the deal if it reached the wrong hands. The implications hit me like a punch to the chest. This wasn't just an affair. Michael was helping someone steal confidential information from my company. On the screen, Sarah's hand moved to his shoulder. The gesture looked almost affectionate, but something about it felt controlling. You promised me this would be done, she said softly. Michael finally looked up at her. I'm working on it, he replied. Sarah smiled. Then she leaned down and kissed him. The room around me seemed to collapse inward. 12 years of marriage. Every memory. Every moment. All of it suddenly felt like it had been built on sand. Derek paused the video. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he looked at me carefully. This isn't just cheating, he said quietly. No, I whispered. My voice felt hollow. It's much worse than that. And the worst part was, this was only the beginning of what we were about to discover. That night, after watching the footage, the house felt different. Not physically. Everything looked the same. The same couch, the same framed photos on the walls, the same quiet suburban street outside the windows. But the air inside felt heavier, like the truth had seeped into the walls. Michael came home around 10 that evening. I heard the garage door open, the familiar sound of his footsteps entering the kitchen. Normally, I would have called out to him. That night, I stayed perfectly still on the couch. When he walked into the living room, he smiled the way he always did. The same warm smile that used to make me feel safe. "Hey," he said, loosening his tie. "Long day." I forced myself to return a small smile. "Yeah?" "Client meetings all afternoon," he replied casually. "I'm exhausted." He leaned down and kissed my forehead. The same affectionate gesture he had done thousands of times over the years. But now, all I could think about was the video. His tense posture, Sarah's hand on his shoulder, the way they kissed, and the words that kept echoing in my mind. "You need to get those documents from her home office." I felt like I was watching a stranger move through my house. Michael walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. "Did you eat yet?" he called out. "Yeah," I replied quietly. He poured himself a drink, whiskey, 2 ice cubes, exactly the way he always did. The clinking sound of the glass felt strangely loud in the quiet house. Then he sat beside me on the couch. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The television played softly in the background. Some late-night talk show I wasn't actually watching. Michael draped an arm around my shoulders, a gesture that used to feel natural. Now it felt suffocating. "You seem quiet tonight," he said gently. "I'm just tired," I replied, which wasn't a lie. I was exhausted, emotionally drained in a way I had never experienced before. Because betrayal does something strange to your mind. It rewrites memories. Suddenly, every moment from the past few months began replaying differently in my head. The late nights, the sudden work dinners, the carefully practiced explanations, even the flowers he had brought home. Were they apologies or distractions? Had he been lying to me every single day while plotting to destroy my company? The thought made my chest ache. That night, long after Michael had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake staring into the darkness. I kept asking myself the same question. How long? How long had this been happening? How long had the man I trusted most been secretly working against me? And the answer, I realized slowly, might be longer than I wanted to know. But the most painful part wasn't the anger, or even the betrayal. It was the emptiness. The realization that the life I believed in, the marriage I had built, might never have been real in the first place. Around 3 a.m, I finally slipped out of bed and walked downstairs. The house was silent. I stood in my home office doorway for a long moment. The safe containing my company's documents sat quietly against the wall, untouched. For now. But Michael knew the combination. He had watched me open it dozens of times over the years. Trust. That was the cruelest part of all. I had given him everything. My heart, my loyalty, even access to the very thing he was now trying to steal. I leaned against the doorway, feeling something inside me finally shift. The sadness didn't disappear, but something else began to take its place. Clarity. Michael thought I didn't suspect anything. He thought he was still in control. That illusion would be very useful, because if he and Sarah were planning something, then I needed to know exactly what it was. And the only way to do that was to let them keep thinking they had already won. The real breakthrough came from something completely unexpected. Not a camera. Not the tracker Derek had installed in Michael's car, but a simple mistake. 3 nights after we watched the office footage, Michael was working from home. He had spread documents across the coffee table while answering emails on his laptop. I stayed in the kitchen, pretending to read project reports. From the outside, everything looked normal. Just another quiet weekday evening. Around 9 o'clock, Michael stretched and closed his laptop halfway. "I'm going to take a quick shower," he said. "My head is killing me." "Long day?" I asked casually. "You have no idea," he muttered. Then he disappeared upstairs. I waited. 30 seconds. 1 minute. Then I heard the bathroom shower turn on. My heart began pounding. I walked slowly into the living room. Michael's laptop sat on the coffee table exactly where he'd left it. The screen was still open, and his email inbox was still visible. For a moment, I hesitated. This was a line I had never crossed before in our marriage. But that marriage no longer existed, so I sat down and looked. The message thread with Sarah Harrison was right there, not hidden, not encrypted. Just sitting in plain sight. My hands trembled as I opened it, and the moment I started reading, I realized everything was even worse than I thought. Sarah, tomorrow night, Fairmont Hotel, room 812. Michael, understood. My pulse began hammering in my ears. I kept scrolling. The messages went back months, dozens of conversations, plans, discussions. And then I saw the one that made my stomach drop. Sarah, bring the Carter files. The financial projections will be enough to destroy their valuation. Michael, Emily has them locked in the home safe, but I watched her enter the combination last week. My throat went dry. He had been watching me. Memorizing the safe code. Preparing to steal my company's financial strategy. I continued reading. Each message made the situation clearer and more horrifying. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning corporate espionage. Sarah's firm represented a competing buyer in the acquisition negotiations for my company. If they obtained my internal financial projections, they could undercut our deal and acquire the company for far less than its actual value. And the payoff would be enormous. One message made my hands shake so badly I had to steady myself on the table. Sarah, once the deal collapses, we move to phase 2. Michael, the divorce? Yes, my contact on the bench will make sure you get everything. The house, the company shares, alimony. Michael, Emily will never see it coming. I felt something inside my chest crack. 12 years of marriage, and he was planning to destroy me completely. Then I saw the final message in the thread, the one that made my vision blur with anger. Michael, after this is done, we'll finally be free. Sarah, Barcelona is waiting. Barcelona. They were planning to take my money and disappear together. For several seconds, I just sat there staring at the screen. The house was silent except for the distant sound of running water upstairs. Michael was in the shower, completely unaware that his entire plan had just been exposed. Slowly, carefully, I pulled out my phone. I photographed every message, every date, every detail. Then I emailed the screenshots to Derek and to a brand new cloud storage account under a different password. Backups. Multiple layers of protection. When I finished, I closed the email thread and returned the laptop exactly the way it had been. Then I walked back into the kitchen. By the time Michael came downstairs 15 minutes later, I was calmly washing dishes. He wrapped his arms around my waist from behind. Thanks for letting me work tonight, he said softly. I forced myself not to flinch. Of course, I replied. He kissed my neck. The same affectionate gesture that once meant love. Now it just felt like poison. Because at that moment, I knew everything. I knew about the affair. I knew about the theft. And I knew about the plan to destroy my life. Michael thought he was playing the long game, but he had just made one fatal mistake. He underestimated me. And now, the game had officially begun. Once I knew the truth, everything became very simple, painful, but simple. Michael and Sarah believed they were in control. They thought they were the smartest people in the room. They thought I was still the trusting wife who spent her days managing construction sites while they quietly dismantled my life behind my back. So I did the smartest thing I could do. I let them keep believing that. But behind the scenes, I started preparing my response. The first person I called was my lawyer, William Rothberg. William had represented my company for years. He was a quiet man with silver hair and the kind of reputation that made opposing attorneys nervous. When I showed him the emails, the video from Derek's camera, and the screenshots from Michael's laptop, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Well, he said, that's not just infidelity. I folded my arms. What is it? He looked at me carefully. It's corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, theft of trade secrets. The words hung in the air. Michael hadn't just betrayed me. He had committed crimes, serious ones, Can we prove it? I asked. William smiled slightly. With this amount of evidence, he said. Yes, but I wasn't finished yet. Because Michael and Sarah had already scheduled the next step of their plan. And ironically, it was happening in my own home. Michael had been organizing a firm celebration party at our house that Friday night. He told me it was to celebrate a recent successful deal. Now I knew the real reason. Sarah would be there, along with several senior attorneys from their firm, important witnesses, and that gave me an opportunity too perfect to ignore. Over the next few days, I prepared carefully every email, every recording, every photograph. All of it was transferred onto a flash drive connected to our living room entertainment system, ready to play on the large television mounted on the wall. Friday evening arrived, with cold rain tapping softly against the windows. Guests began arriving around 7. Expensive suits, polished smiles, glasses of wine, and quiet conversations about business deals. Michael moved through the room like the perfect host, charming, confident, completely unaware of what was about to happen. At 7:30, Sarah Harrison walked through the door. Her posture was calm, her expression professional. She shook my hand as if nothing in the world was wrong. "Emily," she said smoothly, "your husband speaks very highly of you." "I'm sure he does," I replied. Michael stood beside her, watching us both. Neither of them had the slightest idea that I already knew everything. By 8:30, the party was in full swing. Laughter, music, wine glasses clinking. That's when I walked into the center of the room and tapped a spoon lightly against my glass. The sound cut through the chatter. Everyone turned toward me. Michael smiled proudly, clearly expecting a polite toast. Sarah stood beside him, arms crossed casually. "Thank you all for coming tonight," I began calmly. My husband told me this would be a memorable evening. Several guests chuckled politely. I picked up the remote control, and I couldn't agree more. I pressed a button. The television behind me flickered to life. At first, the screen displayed a simple email, then another, and another. The messages between Michael and Sarah appeared in large text. The room went completely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Guests stared at the screen as the conversation unfolded. Plans to steal company files. Discussions about destroying my acquisition deal. The plan to fabricate evidence during a divorce. And finally, the mention of Barcelona. Michael's face turned white. Sarah's smile vanished instantly. The room felt frozen. Then I switched to the next file. Photos appeared on the screen. Nathan's surveillance pictures. Michael and Sarah entering a hotel together, leaving hours later. Kissing in a parking garage. Someone in the room gasped. Another person whispered something under their breath. Sarah took a step toward the television. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Michael looked like he couldn't breathe, but I wasn't finished. "Actually," I said quietly, "there's one more thing." I pressed the final button. The audio recording from Derek's camera began playing. Sarah's voice filled the room. Michael's voice followed. Clear. Undeniable. Both of them discussing the plan to steal my company's financial documents and how the acquisition could be manipulated once they had them. When the recording ended, the silence in the room felt suffocating. Several lawyers had already pulled out their phones. Some were backing slowly toward the door. Sarah looked furious. Michael looked like a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. "This is illegal," he finally said hoarsely. "You can't record private conversations." I looked directly at him. "In this state," I said calmly, "only one person in the conversation has to consent to the recording." Then I smiled slightly. "And since you were talking about committing crimes against my company, that person was me." Michael opened his mouth to speak again, but at that exact moment, the front door opened, and William Rothberg walked in, holding a thick folder of legal documents. "Mr. Michael Carter," he said clearly, "you've been served." The room erupted into chaos, because in a single night, Michael and Sarah had just lost everything. After that night, everything collapsed faster than I expected. Not with dramatic screaming matches or endless courtroom battles, just paperwork. Ironically, the same tool Michael had spent his entire career manipulating. Monday morning, my lawyer filed for divorce on the grounds of infidelity and fraud. The evidence package was over 200 pages long. emails, recordings, surveillance photos, and financial documents. At the same time, William filed a civil lawsuit against Michael and Sarah for corporate espionage, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft of trade secrets. But the legal consequences didn't stop there. The State Bar Association opened an ethics investigation into both of them within 48 hours. Corporate lawyers live and die by their reputation, and Michael's reputation had just been incinerated in front of half his firm. By Tuesday afternoon, Sarah Harrison had been terminated. No farewell dinner. No graceful resignation, just security escorting her out of the building with a cardboard box. Michael didn't last much longer. His partnership was revoked within days. The firm publicly distanced itself from him to avoid being dragged into the investigation. Then things got worse. The FBI's white-collar crime division opened a case once my lawyer forwarded them the recordings and emails. Turns out corporations take trade secret theft very seriously. Michael tried to call me several times during those first weeks. Text messages, emails, even handwritten letters delivered to the house. I deleted every single one without reading them. There was nothing left to say. In court, the divorce proceedings moved quickly. Our prenuptial agreement, something Michael once joked about protecting him, ended up protecting me instead. The judge reviewed the evidence quietly, occasionally glancing over his glasses at Michael with visible disgust. Michael walked away with almost nothing. No share of my company, no alimony, no claim to the house. He was also ordered to cover a significant portion of the legal fees. Actions, after all, have consequences. A few months later, I heard through mutual acquaintances that Sarah had moved out of state after losing her law license. Michael followed not long after. Apparently, their dream of Barcelona never happened. Funny how reality tends to ruin plans built on lies. As for me, life slowly became quiet again. Not the hollow silence of betrayal, but a calm, honest quiet. The acquisition deal went through once the espionage attempt was neutralized. My company's value nearly tripled within a year. Eventually, I sold my shares and stepped back from daily operations. After 15 years of relentless work, I allowed myself something I had never truly had before: freedom. I bought a small cabin in the mountains. The Challenger restoration I'd been working on for years is finally finished now. Sometimes I take it out on long drives through winding mountain roads, with the windows down and the music loud. No lies, no secrets, just open air and the sound of the engine. People sometimes ask me if I regret how everything ended, if I should have handled it quietly, if exposing Michael publicly was too harsh. But they misunderstand something important. Michael didn't just cheat. He tried to destroy everything I had built. My company, my reputation, my future. And when someone tries to burn down your entire life, you don't owe them mercy. You owe them the truth. Because the truth has a way of cleaning things out, like rain washing dust off a road. And sometimes things have to burn down completely before you can rebuild something better. My marriage was one of those things, but from the ashes of it, I built a life based on something far stronger than love: truth.